Welcome back to the Midnight Tapes. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down low. Pull the blanket up, and let the rain settle around the windows until the room feels smaller, warmer, and farther away from everything outside. Tonight, all 8 stories come from hospitals after dark. There is a silence that belongs only to hospitals at night. It is not the silence of an empty house, or a sleeping street, or a forest after rain. It is a working silence, a silence with machines breathing inside it. Somewhere, behind closed curtains, monitors beep softly. Somewhere, a pump clicks. Somewhere, rubber saws whisper over polished floors, and a trolley wheel complains once before going quiet again. The day staff are gone. The visitors have been gently pushed out into the wet parking lot. The cafeterias are half closed. The waiting rooms are dim. The main door is still open and closed, because pain and fear keep their own hours, but most of the building has lowered its voice. People who work nights in hospitals learn the shape of that quiet. They learn which sounds matter and which sounds can be ignored. They learn the difference between a patient turning in bed and a patient falling. They learn how far a call bell can echo down an empty corridor. They learn how the elevators open by themselves sometimes, how lights flicker in old wings, how air moves from rooms where no windows open. They also learn what not to say too loudly at 3 in the morning. Hospitals are practical places. They are full of charts, protocols, hand sanitizer, medication rounds, and small acts of exhausted kindness. But they are also places built on thresholds. People arrive there before they are born. People leave there after they die. They wait there while families hold their breath. They wake there changed. They sleep there and do not wake. A hospital spends its whole life standing on the line between this world and whatever comes after it. And at night, when the wards are dim and the corridors stretch farther than they should, that line can seem very thin. These stories came from nurses, orderlies, cleaners, porters, junior doctors, night supervisors, and people who did the jobs most of us never think about. They came from the ones who stayed awake while everyone else slept. They came from people who answered bells, moved bodies, carried sheets, checked locks, ran toward alarms, and walked past doors that should have stayed closed. Most of them did not want to tell the stories at first. That is another thing about hospital people. They can describe blood, grief, panic, and impossible decisions with a calmness that unsettles everyone else, but ask them about the thing they saw in the corridor, and they become careful. They lower their voices. They look toward the nearest door. Not because they are trying to be dramatic. Because they know how quickly a serious person can be made to sound foolish. So they say it only after trust has been earned. They say it in break rooms, in parking lots after shift, in messages sent at 2 in the morning when sleep will not come. They say, I know how this sounds. They say, I was tired, but not that tired. They say, you don't have to believe me. Then they tell you anyway, because keeping it alone is worse. You do not have to stay awake for all of them. Let your eyes close whenever they want to. You are not on shift tonight. No one is waiting for you at the end of a corridor. No call light is blinking over your door. You are home, warm and well, far from any ward. The rain is only rain. The dark is only dark. Just do not answer the call light from the empty room. Before we begin, let the building in your mind become quiet. Picture the hospital after midnight, when the polished floors hold long reflections of ceiling lights and every sound seems to travel farther than it should. Picture the nurse's station with one lamp left on, the paper charts stacked in a tired pile, the computer screens glowing blue, the half-finished cups of coffee going cold beside pens that have been borrowed and never returned. Picture the patient rooms with their curtains drawn, their beds raised or lowered to different heights, their machines blinking in patient rhythms. Every door has a number. Every number has a history. Some of those histories are recent, written in fresh ink. Some are older than the staff who now walk past them. A hospital does not sleep, but it dreams. That is what the night staff understand. The building continues its work, yet some other layer of it wakes up after dark. Old footsteps cross new floors. Old alarms ring through updated speakers. Old rooms remember hands on rails, whispers beside pillows, last breaths taken while rain touched the windows. The stories tonight live in that layer. They are not loud stories. They are the kind that happen just outside the corner of your eye while you are tired enough to doubt yourself and trained enough to keep working anyway. So do not listen for monsters. Hospitals rarely make room for anything so simple. Listen instead for small wrongness. A bed made when no patient is assigned. A woman in a coat who pauses too long at a doorway. A drawer that should be closed. A voice on the speaker no operator sent. A nurse everyone is grateful for, though no one can find her name. These are the things that stay with people who work nights, because they are close enough to ordinary life to follow you home. Let us begin. The call light from the empty room. I worked nights as a nurse on a medical ward for long enough that the ward began to feel less like a workplace and more like a second body. I knew the sounds it made when it was calm, and the sounds it made when something was about to go wrong. I knew the rhythm of the medication trolley wheels, the hum of the vending machine near the staff room, the soft click of the automatic doors at the far end of the corridor, and the little electronic chime that meant a patient had pressed their call button. The call lights were the heartbeat of the night shift. They were annoying sometimes, of course. Anyone who has worked a ward knows that. Some patients pressed because they were in pain. Some pressed because they were scared. Some pressed because they had dropped the remote, or needed water, or forgot what time it was, or simply woke in the dark and wanted to hear another human voice. You answered all of them, because that was the job, and because a call light is a very simple promise. Someone presses a button, and someone comes. That was what made room 14 so hard to ignore. Room 14 was at the end of the left corridor, just before the old storage alcove where we kept spare pillows and 4 stands that never rolled straight. It was a single room, not large, with a window that looked out onto the ambulance bay roof and a small bathroom with a door that stuck if the humidity was high. The patient who had been in there, a quiet man recovering from pneumonia, had been discharged that afternoon. I had watched housekeeping strip the bed. I had seen the mattress wiped down. I had signed the board myself when the room became vacant. So when room 14's call light came on just after midnight, I started toward it automatically, then stopped with my hands still on the counter at the nurse's station. The panel showed the room number in orange. 14. The same little tone repeated every few seconds. I looked at the bedboard. Room 14 vacant. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it. A glitch was not impossible. The system was old, and hospital electronics have a sense of humor that is not always funny. Sometimes a bed alarm triggered without a patient in the bed. Sometimes the printer spat out a lab label at 3 in the morning for a sample that had been collected 2 days earlier. Machines in hospitals do strange things, especially when no one has the budget to replace them. I silenced the call from the desk. The orange light went dark. 2 seconds later, it came back on. I remember the small irritation more than fear. I was tired, behind on notes, and had 2 patients who needed pain medication within the next half hour. I muttered something I would not have said in front of a patient, and walked down the corridor. Room 14's door was closed. The little light above it glowed steadily, as if someone inside were waiting. The room was locked, because empty rooms were locked at night to keep visitors from wandering in and to keep confused patients from settling themselves where they should not. I took out my key, opened the door, and reached for the light switch. The room was exactly as it should have been. Dark. Empty. Bare bed. No sheets. No pillow. No patient. The bathroom door was half open, the way housekeeping always left it. The call button cord hung neatly from the wall near the head of the bed, clipped into place, nowhere near anything that could have pressed it. I stepped inside anyway. Nurses become suspicious of empty rooms. You check behind curtains. You check the bathroom. You look at the floor on both sides of the bed, because sometimes a confused patient from another room decides to go exploring and ends up somewhere impossible. But there was no one in room 14. I reset the wall panel, closed the door, locked it, and went back to the station. Before I reached the desk, the light came on again. That was the beginning. All night, room 14 called. It did not ring constantly. That would almost have been easier. It waited. 10 minutes. 20. Sometimes half an hour. Just long enough for me to settle into another task, just long enough for me to believe maybe it had stopped, and then the chime would sound again, and the orange square would glow on the panel. Room 14. I reset it from the desk. It came back. I went to the door. Empty. I reset it in the room. It came back. By 3 in the morning, I had stopped being irritated and started being cold. Hospitals are full of stories, but nurses tend to collect them in private. We are trained to be practical. We do not tell a new staff member that the west stairwell feels wrong after midnight, or that patients in certain rooms ask about children no one else can see, or that the smell of roses sometimes comes before a death. Not immediately. We wait. We see if they stay. We see if they notice things for themselves. Then, maybe, during a quiet hour with bad coffee in paper cups, someone mentions something and watches your face to decide whether you are safe to tell. At that point, I was still new enough to think every odd thing had a maintenance explanation. Near 4, the senior nurse came back from break and saw me glaring at the panel. 14 again? She asked. I looked up too fast. You know about it? She took the seat beside me and began signing off medication checks with the calm of someone who had made peace with things I had not yet met. It does that. The room is empty. I know. Locked. I know. The call button isn't being pressed by anything. She initialed a box. Just answer it. I laughed because I thought she was joking, and because I wanted very badly for it to be a joke. She did not look at me. When it rings, she said, go in. Stand by the bed. Say I'm here. What do you need? Wait a moment. Then leave. It settles if you answer it. That's ridiculous. Yes. And if I don't? That made her stop writing. Not dramatically. She simply let the pen rest against the paper and looked down the corridor toward room 14. It gets worse, she said. I did not like the way she said worse. Not louder. Not more frequent. Worse. For the next hour, because I was tired and young and stubborn, I refused. Room 14 rang. I silenced it. It rang again. I silenced it. I told myself I was not going to play along with a ward superstition. I had patients to care for, living patients, real patients, people with pain scores and blood pressures and medication charts. I was not going to waste time speaking into an empty room. At 4:22, room 14's light came on again. I ignored it. 30 seconds later, room 15 lit up beside it. Room 15 was occupied by a woman who had been sleeping heavily all night after surgery. I went there first, thinking she needed help. She was asleep. The call button lay untouched on her blanket. I reset it and went back. Room 16 lit up. Then room 10. Then room 8. Then, one by one, down the entire board, every light began to glow. The chimes overlapped until the station filled with a thin, frantic music. Above the doors, the corridor blinked with orange lights. Rooms with sleeping patients. Empty rooms. Isolation rooms. The treatment room. Even the disabled staff toilet at the end of the hall, which had a patient emergency cord no one ever used, began to alarm. I stood frozen with my hand over the silence button while the senior nurse came up beside me. She did not say "I told you so." She only said, "Answer 14." The corridor seemed longer than it had before. Every light was flashing. Patients began stirring, confused by the noise. A man called out, asking if there was a fire. Somewhere someone coughed. The floor shone dully under the night lights, and all those small orange bulbs glowed above the doors like watching eyes. I unlocked room 14. The room was dark. The air inside felt different from the corridor. Not colder exactly. Thinner. As if someone had been waiting there without breathing. I stepped to the side of the stripped bed and tried to make my voice sound like the voice I used with frightened patients. "I'm here," I said. The alarms kept ringing behind me. "What do you need?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light over the door went off. One by one, down the ward, all the others went dark too. The sudden silence was so complete that I heard the rain ticking against the window. After that, I answered room 14. I answered it on nights when I was tired enough to feel hollow. I answered it on nights when we were short-staffed, when medication rounds ran late, when admissions came in back-to-back and the ward smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. I answered it on Christmas Eve, with paper decorations taped to the nurse's station and a plastic tree blinking beside the linen cupboard. I answered it during heat waves, during snow, during power cuts when the emergency lights turned everything red. The pattern was always the same. The light came on. I went in. The room was empty. I stood beside the bed and said, "I'm here. What do you need?" I waited for a breath, or the suggestion of one, or some sign that I was being heard. Then the light went off. Sometimes, just before it went dark, I felt a small change in the room, like pressure easing after a storm. Sometimes I thought I heard fabric shifting on the bare mattress, though there was no sheet. Once, only once, the bathroom tap turned on by itself while I was standing there, ran for 3 seconds, and stopped. I never told anyone that part. It felt too intimate somehow. Like sharing a detail about a patient who could not give permission. I tried to learn who had died in room 14. Every ward has history, but hospital records do not keep the kind of answers ghosts require. People die in every room eventually. Some deaths are sudden. Some are expected. Some are lonely in ways that leave marks no maintenance team can scrub away. The senior nurse would never say whose call it was. When I asked, she only told me that before my time, room 14 had been a different sort of room, back when the ward was busier and less kind, back when dying patients were sometimes tucked out of sight because there were too few hands and too much noise. "Maybe someone rang and no one came," she said once. "Maybe now we come. That's all." That answer stayed with me more than any ghost story could have. Years later, after I moved to days and then left that hospital entirely, I met a nurse who still worked on the ward. We were both at a training course, drinking coffee that tasted like cardboard, and I asked about room 14 before I could stop myself. She smiled a little. Still rings. You answer it? Of course. Does it still spread if you don't? Her smile faded. No one tests that anymore. Good, I thought. Good. Because there are many terrible things in a hospital. Pain that cannot be controlled. Families who arrive too late. Alarms that mean exactly what you fear they mean. But somehow, the call light from the empty room frightened me in a different way, because it was so simple. No face in a mirror. No hand from under a bed. Just a button pressed in the dark by someone who still needed a nurse. And maybe that is all haunting is sometimes. A need that outlives the body. A small light over a door. A promise still waiting to be kept. So if you ever work nights on a ward, and a call light comes on from an empty, locked room, do not laugh at the older nurses when they tell you what to do. Take a breath. Walk down the corridor. Open the door. Stand beside the bed. And say, gently, as if someone frightened and alone is listening, I'm here. What do you need? There is one more thing I have never been able to forget. On my last week on that ward, I was training a new nurse on nights. She was clever, confident, the kind of person who learned systems quickly and did not like being told that some rules existed outside the manual. Near 3 a.m, room 14 rang. I watched her look at the board, then at the bed list, exactly the way I had years before. I saw the small frown. I heard her say, "That room is empty." I almost let her find out on her own. That is how these ward traditions usually pass down, through fear then belief. But I was tired of making people afraid when kindness would do. So I took her with me. I unlocked the door, switched on the low light, and showed her the bare bed, the clipped cord, the empty bathroom. Then I stood beside the mattress and spoke into the quiet. I'm here. What do you need? The light went off. The new nurse did not laugh. She looked at the bed for a long time and whispered, Who is it? I told her the truth, or the closest thing I had. I don't know. But they need answering. After that, she answered it too. That is how the ward kept going. Not because everyone understood, but because enough of us were willing to keep a small promise to someone the records had forgotten. Sometimes I wonder whether room 14 still rings because the patient is trapped, or because the ward itself is ashamed. Maybe the building remembers every call that took too long, every patient who waited in pain while staff were stretched thin, every bell pressed by a hand too weak to press twice. Maybe room 14 is not one person at all. Maybe it is every unanswered call gathered into one light, one door, one empty bed asking, night after night, whether someone will come this time. That thought frightens me more than any ghost. Because it means the haunting is not separate from the hospital. It means the haunting is made of ordinary failure, ordinary exhaustion, ordinary impossible workloads, and the terrible gap between wanting to care for everyone and being given only 2 hands. The rain is still falling. Stay with me. Here is the next one. The patient who knew. There was an old man on our ward who had been there so long that no one could remember the ward without him. His name was Mr. Alden, though most of us called him Arthur when the charge nurse was not close enough to hear. He was small and thin, with wrists like dry twigs and eyes that were clearer than they should have been for someone his age. He had the kind of politeness that belongs to an older world. He thanked you when you changed his water jug. He apologized when he pressed the call bell. He called every nurse dear, not in a patronizing way, but as if he truly meant it, as if each person who came to his bedside had become briefly precious to him. He was not the sickest patient on the ward. Not at first. He had heart failure, failing kidneys, old lungs that worked hard for every breath, and a collection of diagnoses that seemed to grow each time a consultant reviewed him. But he was stable in the way some long-term patients become stable. Fragile, yes, but familiar. We knew his baseline. We knew his bad days and better days. He liked tea with too much milk. He liked the curtains open at night, because he said the corridor light made him feel less alone. He asked after staff members' children, and remembered exam dates and weddings and names better than some of us did. He was gentle, and we loved him. That made what he did harder to dismiss. The first time I heard him say it, I was helping settle him for the night. It was just after 10. The medication round was nearly done, the visitors had gone, and the ward had begun to sink into that uneasy half-sleep hospitals manage after dark. I tucked his blanket around his knees because he was always cold, and he took my hand in both of his. "Roommate tonight, dear," he said. I thought he was asking me to check on another patient. "What about roommate?" He patted my fingers. "He'll be going home. Not that home. The real one. Tonight, I think." There are moments when your training and your instinct move in opposite directions. My training told me Arthur was confused, perhaps hypoxic, perhaps drifting in that half-dreaming state old patients enter before sleep. My instinct told me he was entirely lucid. Roommate held a middle-aged man recovering from an infection. He was stable. Chatty even. His wife had visited earlier and brought him fruit he was not supposed to eat. He had complained about the television remote and asked when he could go home. There was nothing about him that suggested death was near. I gave Arthur the soothing smile we use when patients say strange things and told him to get some rest. By morning, roommate was empty. He died at 3:17. Sudden arrhythmia. The team worked on him for a long time. There had been no warning. Coincidence is a generous word in hospitals. We use it often because the alternative is too exhausting. People die unexpectedly. Old patients say odd things. Humans are good at making patterns after the fact. So the first time, we called it coincidence. The second time, less so. "Room 12 tonight," Arthur said a week later, while a healthcare assistant adjusted his pillows. "Poor love. She looks tired. She'll be glad to rest." Room 12 was an elderly woman with pneumonia who had seemed brighter that afternoon. She died before dawn. After the third time, the night staff stopped joking about it. It became one of those ward facts no one wrote down. Arthur knew. Not every night. Sometimes many nights passed with nothing. He would drink his milky tea, thank us for our trouble, ask about the rain, and sleep. Then, one evening, he would take someone's hand and say a room number in that mild, sorrowful voice, and everyone who heard would feel the shift run through the ward. He was never gleeful. That is important. He was not cruel. He did not announce deaths like prophecies. He spoke of them gently, almost respectfully, as if he were telling us the name of someone whose train had arrived. If we became upset, he looked upset too. "I don't make it happen, dear," he told one of the junior nurses when she begged him not to say it. "I only notice when they're packing." That phrase went around the night team like a chill. When a patient died after Arthur named them, we found ways to explain it. Maybe he saw clinical signs we were too busy to notice. Maybe old people recognize death in other old people. Maybe the dying give off cues too subtle for charts and machines, and Arthur, lying awake night after night in the dim ward, had become tuned to them. He knew the breathing of the place. He knew who had stopped fighting. He knew who had begun to let go. That explanation comforted us until the night he mentioned the woman in the hall. It was a wet autumn night, the kind where the parking lot lights turned the rain silver and every visitor came in smelling of damp wool. We were understaffed, naturally. Hospitals seemed to sense bad weather and reduce their staffing out of spite. Arthur had been unsettled all evening, not agitated, exactly, but watchful. His curtains were open. His head was turned toward the corridor. One of the younger nurses, Emily, was with him near midnight. Emily was kind, new, and still carried the belief that if she asked the question gently enough, the world might answer honestly. "Arthur," she said, smoothing his blanket, "how do you always know?" He looked at her as if she had asked something obvious. "I see her," he said. Emily glanced toward the corridor. "C'est vous?" "The lady." Later, Emily told us she almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the alternative would have been to show fear, and fear can upset patients. She asked him what lady he meant. Arthur smiled. "The one who comes for them. She walks down the hall most nights. Very quiet. Very patient. She stops outside a door when it's time. Then she waits. In the morning, that bed is empty." Emily's hand froze on the blanket. "What does she look like?" Arthur seemed to consider this. "Kind, I think. Not pretty. Not ugly. Old and young both. A little tired. She wears gray. Or maybe the light makes her gray. She doesn't come in until they are ready. She just waits outside." Then he lifted one trembling finger and pointed down the corridor. "She's there now. Outside room 6. Emily looked. The corridor was empty. Room 6 held a man recovering from a minor stroke. He had eaten dinner. He had joked with his daughter on the phone. His observations were fine. He was due to be moved to rehab later that week. Emily tried to keep her voice even. "Are you sure, Arthur?" He looked almost apologetic. "Yes, dear. Room 6 tonight. She has her hand on the doorframe. She won't be long." Emily came to the desk pale and told us. We checked room 6 more often than we needed to. At midnight he was asleep. At 1 asleep. At 2, he complained of needing the bathroom and then settled again. At 3, his monitor alarmed. By 3:40, he was gone. No one said Arthur's name afterward. No one needed to. From then on, the night corridor became different. Every doorway had space beside it. That is the only way I can describe it. Before, a door was just a door. After Arthur, every door seemed to have a waiting place just outside it, a patch of floor where someone could stand unseen, patient and gray, with one hand resting on the frame. Some nurses refused to ask Arthur anything after that. Others could not help themselves. On bad nights, when a patient looked fragile, someone would glance at Arthur's room and whisper, "Has he said anything?" It felt shameful, wanting to know. It also felt impossible not to. Arthur understood more than we wished he did. Once, after naming a patient who later survived the night against all expectation, a doctor made a comment that perhaps the old man had finally been wrong. Arthur heard about it somehow and shook his head. "No," he told me. "She waited outside, but he wasn't ready. Sometimes they send her away. Not often. But sometimes." "Who sends her away?" I asked. Arthur looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I saw the man he must have been before age and illness narrowed him into that bed. "The same ones who sent her in, I suppose." I never asked again. Months passed. Arthur declined slowly. His good days became smaller islands in a wide gray sea. He slept more. He ate less. His hands, once always reaching for ours, stayed under the blanket. But his mind, when he woke, remained clear enough to be kind. One evening, near winter, the ward was unusually peaceful. Snow had fallen earlier, and the windows reflected the corridor lights so that outside looked like another ward, darker and colder, running parallel to ours. I was at Arthur's bedside, giving him a mouth swab because he was too weak to drink. He opened his eyes and smiled. "Hello, dear." "Hello, Arthur. Busy tonight?" "Not too bad." "Good. That's good." He turned his head toward the corridor. The movement was slow, but his eyes sharpened. For a moment, I thought he was going to name another patient. My stomach tightened with the old dread. Instead, he gave a small, delighted sigh. "Oh," he said. "She's outside my room tonight. Isn't that nice?" I could not speak. His eyes stayed on the doorway. I wondered if she'd come in for me, or if someone else would. But it's her. I always liked her. She looks kinder up close. I gripped the bed rail. The corridor beyond his door was empty. Of course it was. But the space just outside his room seemed occupied in a way I cannot prove. The light changed there. The air looked denser. The fine hairs on my arms rose beneath my sleeves. "Arthur," I said, and hated how small my voice sounded. He turned back to me, and his expression was so peaceful that it almost broke me. "Don't worry, dear. I won't have to tell you whose it is anymore." He died at 2:12 in the morning, with snow still pressed against the windows and my hand in his. After Arthur died, the ward felt emptier than one bed could explain. His room was cleaned. Another patient came. Then another. Time did what time does in hospitals. It moved on quickly because it had to. But the night staff changed after him. We all learned to glance down the corridor now and then, not because we expected to see anything, but because not looking felt worse. Sometimes, during the last hour before dawn, I would pause at the nurse's station and see a shadow outside a room that vanished when I lifted my head. Sometimes, beside a doorway, I would smell something like cold rain and old lavender. Once, a patient who was dying peacefully asked me who the Grey Lady was, and I told him she was someone who would sit with him until morning. He smiled and said, "Good," and was gone before the sun came up. I do not know what Arthur saw. I do not know whether the lady in the hall was death, or mercy, or simply the shape a tired old man gave to something no living person can understand. But I know this: he was right too many times for coincidence, and too gentle for madness. And ever since, whenever I walk a hospital corridor at night, even one I have never been in before, I notice the spaces outside the doors. I notice how patiently they wait. There was one final rumor about Arthur that I heard years later from a nurse who had stayed on that ward longer than I did. She said that after he died, the prediction stopped, but not completely. No one else ever saw the Grey Lady the way he had. No one sat in bed and named the night's dead with that same gentle certainty. But now and then, when a patient was close to the end and no family could come, someone would find the chair beside the bed pulled slightly closer, though no one admitted moving it. Sometimes the blanket would be tucked with an old-fashioned neatness none of the current staff used. Once, a nurse entered a room moments after a death and heard an elderly man's voice say, very softly, "There you are, dear. Off you go." The room was empty except for the patient who had just passed. I do not know if Arthur became part of the ward's night staff in his own way. I do not know if the people who spend long enough looking down the corridor eventually join what they were watching. But the idea feels right to me. He had spent his last months telling us who was leaving, not to scare us, but to prepare us. Perhaps, once he crossed over, He kept doing the only work left to him, standing near the door, noticing who was afraid, and speaking kindly when the rest of us could not hear. That is the strange mercy of hospitals. Even the frightening stories are sometimes full of care. The lady in the hall might have been deaf, but Arthur was not. Arthur was a witness. A night watchman in a hospital gown. A frail old man with a failing heart who somehow saw the traffic at the border and chose to tell the living, gently, when someone was about to pass through. I still think about the way he smiled when he saw her outside his own room. Not fear. Not dread. Recognition. Relief. As if someone had finally come for him after a very long wait, and he was pleased she had not forgotten. You are doing fine. Let your eyes rest. The next tape is already playing. The visitor after hours. Hospitals have visiting hours because without them, grief would never leave the building. Families would sleep upright in chairs forever. Friends would linger in corridors with flowers gone brown around the edges. People would press their faces to windows and ask for one more minute until the ward could not function at all. So the hospital makes rules. Visiting ends at 8. Exceptions can be made for the dying, for children, for certain kinds of sadness no policy can bear to name. But in general, when the clock passes 8, the visitors go home, and the night staff reclaim the building. I was an orderly on nights, which meant I belonged to the part of the hospital most people did not see. I moved equipment, carried samples, transported patients, restocked supplies, escorted confused relatives, and walked miles of corridor while the rest of the city slept. The night orderly becomes a kind of ghost himself. You learn back routes. You know which lifts are fastest, which doors stick, which vending machine steals coins, which wards keep decent biscuits in the staff room. You are everywhere and nowhere, called only when needed. My patrol route took me through the older medical floors between 2 and 4 in the morning. It was not security, exactly. We had security guards. This was more informal. A moving human presence. A pair of eyes. A way to make sure no one had fallen in a quiet corridor, no visitor had hidden in a side room, no patient had wandered out looking for a bus stop that no longer existed. That was how I first saw her. She was at the far end of the third-floor corridor, walking away from me. A woman in a long dark coat. At first, nothing about her seemed impossible. She was simply not supposed to be there. Visiting had ended hours before. The corridor lights were dimmed. Most patients were asleep. She moved slowly, pausing now and then beside a room, turning her head slightly as if looking in. I called out softly, because you do not shout on a sleeping ward. "Excuse me. Can I help you?" She kept walking. I followed. She turned left at the junction near the linen room. I turned left seconds after her. The corridor was empty. There were no open doors. No side exits except the stairwell at the end, and I would have heard it open. I checked the rooms closest to the corner, expecting to find a lost relative embarrassed to have been caught. Nothing. Sleeping patients. Curtains drawn. The faint smell of floor polish and rain. I told myself she had stepped into a room farther along before I turned the corner. It was plausible enough to carry me through the rest of the shift. 2 nights later, I saw her again. Same floor. Same coat. Same slow walk. This time she was near the nurse's station, but the nurse on duty had her back turned, writing notes, and did not seem to notice. The woman paused outside room 31, looked in for a long moment, then moved on. I walked faster. "Miss? Visiting hours are over." She did not turn. At the corner, she vanished again. After the 4th sighting, I mentioned her to one of the senior nurses. I expected annoyance, maybe a request to call security if I saw her again. Instead, the nurse's face went careful. "Long coat?" she asked. "Yes." "Dark hair?" "I think so. I haven't seen her face." The nurse looked back at her notes. "Don't chase her." That was all. "What does that mean?" "It means don't chase her. If she's not bothering anyone, leave her. Hospitals do this to you. They give you half answers with tired eyes and expect you to survive on them." So I stopped chasing, but I did not stop watching. Over the next month, I saw the visitor after hours at least once a week. Always between midnight and dawn. Always on the older floors. Always walking as if she had all the time in the world. She never hurried. She never touched the patients. She rarely entered a room. Mostly she stopped at doorways, leaned slightly, and looked in. At first, I assumed she had some connection to the hospital, perhaps a relative of a patient who had died there and returned in grief. But there was no pattern to the rooms I could see. She did not visit only one ward. She appeared on medical, surgical, oncology, geriatrics. Once I saw her outside pediatrics, though she did not go in. She stood at the locked double doors, head bowed, then turned away. I began to note the rooms where she paused. Not officially. I was not foolish enough to write it anywhere. But I remembered. Room 31. Bed 5 and baby. Room 12 on the 4th floor. The side room near the lift on oncology. I started checking the patient boards in the mornings, telling myself it was curiosity. The patient in room 31 developed sepsis 2 days later. Bed 5 and baby fell overnight and fractured a hip. Room 12 went into respiratory failure before the weekend. The patient near the oncology lift died quietly on Sunday morning. It was not always death. That somehow made it worse. If she had been only a figure of final endings, I might have understood her, or thought I did. But what she marked seemed broader than death. Decline. Turning points. The moment a recovery bent the wrong way. The hidden complication before anyone else saw it. She was not necessarily collecting. Sometimes she was warning. Sometimes she was only witnessing. And she was methodical. The more I watched, the more I felt she was doing rounds. That word changed everything for me. Rounds. She moved the way staff moved. Not wandering. Not lost. She had a route, a purpose, a professional patience. I carried linen bags and equipment forms. She carried something else. I checked that patients were where they should be. She checked whether they were still meant to stay. One night, I saw her in the reflection of a dark window before I saw her in the hall. It was near 3. Rain streaked the glass, turning the city lights into long trembling lines. I was pushing an empty wheelchair back towards storage when the window ahead showed the corridor behind me. My own shape. The wheelchair handles. The dim ceiling panels. And behind me, walking at the same slow pace, the woman in the dark coat. I stopped. In the reflection, she stopped too. I did not turn around. I could not. For the first time, I could see something of her face in the glass, though not clearly. Pale. Calm. Neither young nor old. Her eyes were lowered not at me, but at the wheelchair, as if she were considering whether someone would need it soon. The overhead light flickered. When it steadied, the reflection behind me was empty. I returned the wheelchair with shaking hands. After that, I stopped asking other staff about her. I already knew enough. Those who had seen her did not want to talk. Those who had not seen her were luckier, and I did not want to make them start looking. The visitor after hours became part of my private map of the hospital, like the lift that opened on the basement when you pressed 4, or the stairwell landing that smelled of cigarette smoke though smoking had been banned for years. Then came the night she looked at me. It was near the end of my time at the hospital. I had already begun thinking about leaving. Nights were wearing me down. My sleep was broken. My temper was short. I had started to feel that the hospital followed me home in smells: disinfectant, stale coffee, rain on concrete, the metallic edge of panic. I told myself I needed daylight work. I told myself it had nothing to do with the woman in the coat. That night, the ward was busy in the way that makes time lose shape. 2 admissions, 1 fall, 1 family who would not leave, 1 patient convinced his bed was a train. By 4, the rush settled. I took a slow patrol through the 3rd floor, grateful for the quiet. I turned the corner by the on-call rooms. She was standing there. Not at the far end. Not half seen. Not moving away. There. Close enough that I could see rain beaded on the shoulders of her dark coat, though she had not come from outside. Close enough to see her hands, bare and pale, folded in front of her. Close enough to understand that her face was ordinary in the most terrible possible way. She looked like someone you might stand behind in a grocery queue. She looked like a teacher, a tired mother, a woman waiting for a bus. Only her eyes made my throat close. They were not empty. They were full of attention. She turned her head and looked directly at me. For months she had ignored me, and I had been able to pretend I was not part of her work. Now she saw me. She smiled politely. Not cruelly. Not warmly. Politely. The way you acknowledge a colleague in a corridor at the end of a long shift. Then she looked at the door beside her. The on-call room. The small room where staff slept between emergencies. The room where I had slept, badly, dozens of times. The room with the narrow bed, the thin blanket, the humming radiator, and the clock that always ran slow. She lifted one hand and touched the door frame. I do not remember backing away. I remember being at the nurse's station with both hands flat on the counter, and no memory of crossing the corridor. I told the charge nurse I was unwell. She took one look at me and did not argue. I never slept in that room again. I handed in my notice that week. Officially, I left because of exhaustion and pay and wanting a life that included sunlight. All of that was true. It was also not the whole truth. Years have passed. I work in a warehouse now, days only. My nights are ordinary. I sleep when the city sleeps. I have not seen the visitor since. But sometimes, in long corridors, especially where the light is dim and the doors are closed, I feel the old hospital map unfold inside me. I notice door frames. I notice where a person could stand just out of sight. I notice reflections in dark windows. And I still wonder whether leaving saved me. Or whether, one day, in some other building, during some other long night, I will turn a corner and see a woman in a dark coat pausing outside my door, doing her rounds, patient as ever, because hospital visitors are only asked to leave at 8. Some of them do not. I have tried, over the years, to make her into something simple. A warning sign. A collector. A hallucination born from exhaustion and fluorescent light. But simple explanations do not survive the details. The visitor did not rush to the dying the way grief does. She did not hover over the already lost. She moved through the hospital before the charts changed, before the blood pressure dropped, before the family was called. She paused at doors where something was about to turn. That makes me think she saw patients not as we saw them, fixed in a moment, but as a sequence already unfolding. To her, perhaps, decline had a visible shape. Perhaps it gathered around the bed like shadow, and she was only checking how far it had spread. There was one patient she paused for who did not worsen. I remember because it bothered me. A young woman, admitted for tests, frightened but physically stable. The visitor stood outside her room for nearly a minute. I expected bad news. None came. The woman was discharged 2 days later. I decided the pattern had broken. Then, months afterward, I saw the same woman in the outpatient lobby, holding a folder against her chest, face pale in that particular way people look after receiving life-changing results. She did not recognize me. Why would she? I was only an orderly who had once walked past her door at night. But I recognized her, and I remembered the visitor standing outside her room, months before the diagnosis had a name. Maybe the visitor did not mark death. Maybe she marked knowledge. The moment the body already knew something the patient had not yet been told. The moment the future entered the room and waited for paperwork to catch up. That, somehow, is worse. I asked myself once why she wore a coat. Not a uniform, not scrubs, not anything that belonged to a hospital. A coat is what visitors wear because they are not staying. It is what you keep on when you are between outside and inside, between arriving and leaving. Perhaps that was the point. She was after hours because she never fully belonged in the building, but she never fully left it either. She came from somewhere beyond visiting time, walked the halls, checked the rooms, and returned to whatever dark lobby waited for her when her rounds were done. The living staff wore badges because the hospital needed to know who we were. She wore none because the hospital knew her already. If your eyes are closed now, let them stay closed. You do not need to see for this one. The morgue tray. The morgue was not the scariest place in the hospital. People who have never worked around death usually think it must be. They imagine shadows, whispers, cold hands reaching from under sheets. But the truth is, the morgue was usually peaceful. It was a clean room in the basement with bright lights, tiled floors, stainless steel surfaces, and a low mechanical hum from the refrigerated drawers. It smelled of disinfectant and cold air. Not decay, not horror. Just cold. I was a night porter, and part of my job was to take the dead down. There is no graceful way to say that. Hospitals wrap the task in procedures and forms, but underneath all of it, someone has to move the body. Someone has to arrive on the ward with the trolley, wait while nurses say goodbye in their own quiet ways, check the identification bands, cover the face, guide the trolley through service corridors and down in the lift. Families rarely see that part. They should not have to. The last journey through the hospital belongs to staff who know how to be respectful without being dramatic. I was good at it. Not because I was cold, but because I understood the importance of calm. The dead had been through enough. The living had too. The morgue drawers were arranged along one wall, each with a number and a handle. You opened them carefully. The tray rolled out on heavy rails with a sound like a drawer in a very old filing cabinet. You transferred the body, checked the tag again, closed the tray, signed the log. That was it. Routine. Sad sometimes, but not frightening. The first open tray was easy to explain. It was near the end of my shift. Dawn had not quite reached the basement windows, which were small, high, and mostly painted over. I went down to check the morgue after a transfer and found drawer 7 open about a foot. The tray was empty. That mattered. If the drawer with an occupant had been left open, I would have been angry as well as uneasy. But empty, it was probably just carelessness. Someone from days, maybe. A funeral director. A pathologist. Another porter. I closed it with my hip, logged my check, and went home. The next morning, Drawer 12 was open, also empty. I closed it. The third time, drawer 3 was open, and it was not empty. I stood in the doorway longer than I want to admit. The tray had been pulled out perhaps 8 inches. Not far. Just enough that the seal had broken and cold air drifted into the room. The sheet over the body had shifted slightly near the shoulder. That could happen when a tray moved. Everything had an explanation if you were willing to bend yourself around it. I checked the log. No one had been down after me. The room required key access. The door had been locked when I arrived. The body tag matched. The drawer mechanism seemed fine. I pushed the tray closed, harder than necessary, and listened until the latch clicked. When I mentioned it to my supervisor, he said maintenance would look at the runners. Maintenance looked. They found nothing. The drawers kept opening. Not every night. That would have made it easier to escalate. Instead, it happened often enough to become a dread and rarely enough to remain deniable. A drawer open at the end of the shift. One tray slightly out. Sometimes empty. Sometimes occupied. Always one drawer. Never two. Never fully open. As if whoever opened them had manners, or limited strength, or simply wanted to make a point. I began checking the morgue at the beginning of my shift. Every drawer closed. Every latch secure. I would pull each handle lightly, one by one, until I felt the resistance. Closed. 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 I would sign the log and leave. In the morning, one would be open. I asked security to check the access records. My key. Occasionally the pathologist. One funeral home pickup. Nothing during the hours when the drawers opened. Maybe vibration, security said. From what? He shrugged. Old building. Old building was the phrase people used when they did not want to say anything else. Then I heard it happen. It was 3:38. I remember because I had just looked at the clock above the service lift and wondered why the last hours before dawn always moved like wet cement. I was in the basement corridor, restocking linen bags, when I heard the morgue door area give a soft metallic groan. Not the door. The rails. If you have worked with morgue trays, you know the sound. A heavy, smooth, reluctant slide. Metal bearing weight. A rubber seal breaking. The faintest sigh of cold air entering warmer air. A drawer opening. I stood still with a folded sheet in my hands. The sound came again, just a little farther. Then stopped. The corridor was empty. The morgue door was closed. Its small square window showed only darkness beyond because the room lights were off. I told myself to call security. I told myself to turn around and go upstairs. Instead, because hospital workers are made foolish by duty, I walked to the door and unlocked it. The lights flickered on with that cold basement delay. Drawer 9 was open. It was occupied. The sheet lay smooth except at the head, where it had sunken slightly over the face. I knew the patient. Not personally, but I had brought him down earlier that night from the cardiac ward. Elderly man. Family had stayed late. The daughter had tucked a small photograph under his folded hands before we covered him. I had noticed because the gesture was tender, and because tender gestures in hospitals can hurt to witness. The drawer was out 6 inches. I approached slowly, though there was no reason to. The dead do not mind haste. The living do. The photograph was no longer under his hands. It was on the floor, just below the open drawer. I picked it up. In the picture, the dead man stood on a beach beside a woman and 2 small children, everyone squinting into sunlight. The photo was dry, ordinary, impossible. It had been under the sheet, under his hands, inside a closed refrigerated drawer. Now it lay face up on the floor, as if it had been dropped. I put it back. I closed the tray. I left the morgue and did not go down alone for the rest of the week. Fear has a way of becoming administrative if enough people share it. We filled out incident forms. We requested another maintenance inspection. We suggested faulty seals, pressure changes, vibration from construction, anything that could be said in a meeting without sounding like children around a campfire. Maintenance replaced parts. Security added a camera outside the morgue door. No one approved a camera inside because of dignity and policy, and because no manager wanted footage of what we were all afraid to see. For 11 nights, nothing opened. Then, on the 12th, drawer 4 was found fully extended. Empty. But drawer 4 had not been empty at the start of the night. I know because I had checked it. The woman assigned to drawer 4 had died on a surgical ward shortly after midnight. I had moved her myself. She was small, with silver hair and a hospital blanket covering the transfer sheet because the nurses said she had always hated being cold. Her paperwork was complete. Her tag was correct. I placed her in drawer 4 and closed it. At 6:10, drawer 4 was open and the tray was empty. There are moments in the hospital when everyone becomes very calm because panic would take too much time. We checked the log. We checked the cameras. The morgue door had not opened. We searched the room. We searched adjacent rooms. We checked whether she had been collected without paperwork, though everyone knew she had not. Security locked down the basement and began a wider search. They found her on the ward she had come from. Not in the bed where she had died. That had already been stripped. She was in the visitor's chair beside it, covered neatly with the hospital blanket. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were closed. She looked like someone waiting for a relative to come back from the cafeteria. No one ever explained how she got there. After that, morgue duty changed. 2 staff members went down together. The drawers were checked in pairs. Security cameras were added in the corridor and outside the lifts. Officially, it was because of the missing body incident, which administration described as a transport error. Unofficially, no one wanted to be alone when the rails started to move. I requested a transfer out of night portering and got it 3 months later. Before I left, a new reporter asked me what the worst part had been. I told him it was not the open drawers. It was not even the missing woman in the chair. It was the feeling that the morgue was not a place where the dead stayed. It was a waiting room. And sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, someone or something came to open the trays and see who was ready to leave. I do not work in hospitals anymore. I avoid basements. I avoid the refrigerated section in large industrial buildings, which is embarrassing but true. Every now and then, in a hotel corridor or an office at night, I hear a drawer slide open somewhere out of sight, and for half a second I am back in that cold room, looking at the line of numbered doors, wondering which one will open next. And when I think of the dead, I no longer imagine them lying still behind stainless steel. I imagine one tray out a few inches, a sheet slightly disturbed, a photograph on the floor, and a hospital bed upstairs, empty but freshly made, waiting for someone who has decided the basement is too cold. For a long time, I thought the morgue trays opened because the dead wanted out. That is the obvious fear. It is also the selfish one, because it turns the dead into intruders and the living into victims. Now I am less sure. What if some part of them simply did not understand the move? 1 hour they were in a warm ward with voices around them, their names spoken, their mouth moistened, their hand held. Then paperwork was signed, curtains drawn, and they were taken down through service corridors to a cold room where no one spoke except to confirm identity. Perhaps something in that transition can go wrong. Perhaps the body arrives in the basement while the person, or the memory of the person, is still trying to find the way back to the last place that felt human. That would explain the beds. The chair. The woman returned to the ward with her blanket. Not horror in the way films would frame it. Homesickness. Confusion. A final objection to being filed away too neatly. Hospitals have processes for death because they must. Without process, grief would flood every corridor. But process can be cold. It has to be. Forms do not know who liked tea with milk, who feared the dark, who wanted the photograph kept close, who was always cold. Maybe the morgue opened its drawers because someone down there remembered what the forms did not. Still, I would not work that duty again. Compassion has limits when the drawer opens in the dark and the room exhales cold air. You can feel sorry for whatever is moving and still run from it. I did both. Breathe slow. The rain has you. Here is the next. The old wing. The hospital had not been built so much as accumulated. That was the only way to understand it. The front entrance was glass and steel, all bright signs and automatic doors, but behind it the building changed eras every few corridors. A modern imaging department opened onto a stairwell from the 1960s. A cheerful pediatric mural ended at a cracked plaster wall older than most of the consultants. Pipes ran where pipes should not. Some floors sloped slightly. There were doors no one used, doors no one had keys for, and doors with labels so faded you could not tell what had once been behind them. At the far end of the second floor, beyond the respiratory ward and past a row of offices used mostly for storage, there was a set of double doors with wired glass windows. Behind them was the old East Wing. Everyone knew about it. No one talked about it much. It had been closed before my time, supposedly because of asbestos, outdated plumbing, and the usual list of reasons old hospital spaces are abandoned. It had once held a long ward, side rooms, treatment bays, and a small nurses' station. Then services moved to the newer building, the wing was decommissioned, and the double doors were locked. A printed sign, laminated years ago and curling at the corners, read, "No entry. Authorized personnel only." There were never any authorized personnel. I was on facilities night support, which meant I fixed small things that could not wait for morning and reported larger things no one would fix for months. My route took me past the old East Wing often. For nearly a year, I passed those doors without caring. They were part of the furniture of the hospital. Locked. Dark. Dead space. Then I saw light under them. It was close to 2 in the morning. I was carrying a toolbox in one hand and a half-eaten sandwich in the other, headed to look at a leaking sink. The corridor was dim, as always. But at the end, beneath the double doors, a narrow line of light stretched across the floor. Not emergency light. Not a reflection. A real, flickering fluorescent glow. I stopped. The East Wing had no active power. That was one of the first things I had learned from the older maintenance staff. The circuits had been isolated years before. No heating, no ventilation beyond passive vents, no equipment, no lights. The place was dead. The light trembled under the doors. I walked closer, every sensible part of me preparing explanations. Maybe someone had gone in for inspection. Maybe a contractor. Maybe temporary power had been connected, and no one told nights. The hospital was always doing things without telling the people who had to walk around it in the dark. Through the wired glass, I could see the corridor beyond. It was lit. Dimly, unevenly, with old fluorescent tubes that buzzed and flickered. The walls were painted a faded institutional green. The floor was dull linoleum. Dust should have covered everything. Instead, the corridor looked worn by use. Not clean, exactly, but active. A trolley stood against one wall. Farther in, a curtain shifted though there was no breeze. Then I heard the monitor. Beep. 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 Soft. Regular. Farther down the wing. A working ward sound from a sealed, unpowered corridor. I backed away and found my supervisor. He was in the maintenance office, reading a paperback with one hand and eating crisps with the other. He looked up when I came in and, before I said anything, sighed. East Wing? I hated him a little for guessing. The lights are on. Leave them. There are monitor sounds. There usually are when the lights are on. Usually? He folded the corner of his page, which told me he expected this conversation to take time. Old parts of hospitals do that, he said. Not often. Often enough. That is not an explanation. No. I waited. He rubbed his eyes. The East Wing was a working ward for decades. Before that, it was something else. Isolation, maybe. Before my time. Lots of people went through there. Lots didn't come out. Places remember. Hospitals especially. At night, sometimes, the old wing runs a shift. Lights, machines, movement. You might see patients. You might see staff. Don't go in. Because of asbestos? He looked at me then, and the tired humor left his face. Because the doors are locked for a reason, and it isn't asbestos. No one tells a story like a hospital veteran. They leave the worst part unsaid and trust you to fill it in. For weeks, I avoided the East Wing as much as possible. But avoidance has limits in an old hospital. Corridors connect where they connect. Work orders happen where they happen. And curiosity is a dangerous thing when you are tired and the building is quiet. The lights came on again in November. This time, I did not fetch my supervisor. I stood at the wired glass and looked. The old ward was running. That is the only word for it. Beds lined the long room beyond the corridor, visible through open double doors farther inside. Patients lay under thin blankets. Some were still. Some turned their heads. I could not see faces clearly through the glass and distance, but I could see shapes, the rise and fall of bodies, the pale arcs of hands on coverlets. Equipment stood beside beds that should not have existed anymore. Old monitors, drip stands, oxygen cylinders, a metal basin on a trolley. The air beyond the glass seemed yellowed, like an old photograph with the sound left in. A nurse walked past. She wore a uniform from another era. A stiff dress, white apron, cap pinned over dark hair. She moved briskly, with the practical stride of someone behind on rounds. She stopped at a bedside, adjusted something, spoke to a patient I could not hear, and moved on. I told myself it was a reflection. A trick. Some training exercise in a supposedly closed wing. But the smell came through the door then, faintly, impossibly. Carbolic soap. Old linen. Hot dust from fluorescent tubes. A hospital smell from before my lifetime. I should have left. Instead, I watched until the lights flickered off all at once, and the old East Wing became dark again. After that, the wing became a bad habit. When my route took me near the doors, I checked for light. Most nights, nothing. Just darkness through wired glass, my own reflection staring back. But sometimes, once every few weeks, the glow returned. Sometimes I heard only machines. Sometimes voices murmured too softly to understand. Once I heard crying. Not a baby. An adult, exhausted and trying not to be heard. The scenes changed. Or perhaps I noticed different parts. One night the ward was full, every bed occupied, staff moving quickly, a sense of pressure in the air as if something terrible had happened nearby and the hospital was overflowing. Another night, only one bed had a patient in it, and all the old-fashioned nurses stood around it with their heads bowed. Once, I saw a doctor in a white coat walk backward down the corridor, one hand pressed to his mouth, as if retreating from something in a side room. The doors never opened. Not for me. There were handles, of course. Real handles. Locks that real keys might fit. I never tried them. The strange thing is, I am not sure whether that was caution or obedience. The old wing had rules. No one had explained them fully, but I felt them. Watch if you must. Do not enter. Do not knock. Do not answer if someone inside knocks first. Because eventually someone did. It was winter, deep and mean. The hospital heating was failing in several areas, and my night was a chain of complaints I could not fix. Near 4, I passed the east wing and saw the lights on brighter than ever. The line under the doors was almost white. Inside, the ward looked busy. Too busy. Nurses moved quickly. A monitor alarm rang somewhere. A patient sat upright in bed, mouth open in a silent cry. I stepped closer to the glass. A nurse approached from the far end. At first, I thought she was simply walking down the corridor. Then I realized she was walking toward me. She was older than the others I had seen, with a severe face and silver hair tucked under her cap. Her uniform was immaculate. She carried a clipboard against her chest. She came straight to the double doors and stopped on the other side of the wired glass. We stood facing each other through the locked doors and the years between us. I could see her clearly now. That was the worst part. Not transparent. Not misty. Solid. Tired. Irritated, even the way senior nurses become irritated when work is piling up and someone useless is blocking the corridor. She lifted her hand. For one insane moment, I thought she was going to wave. Instead, she crooked 2 fingers toward herself. Come in. Then she pointed down the ward behind her, where an alarm continued to flash. She needed help. That feeling hit me with such force that I reached for the door handle before I understood what I was doing. Duty is stronger than fear in a hospital. If a nurse needs help, you move. If an alarm sounds, you answer. If someone points to a patient in distress, you do not stand there debating ghosts. My hand closed around the cold handle. Behind me, someone said my name. I turned so fast my shoulder hit the door. My supervisor stood 10 feet down the corridor in slippers and an old cardigan, having apparently come up from the maintenance office half asleep. His face was white. No, he said. Just that. No. The light behind me went out. The corridor beyond the glass returned to darkness. My hand was still on the handle. The metal felt colder than anything in that building should have been. My supervisor walked over slowly and removed my hand from the door. When they ask for help, he said, that's when you leave. Who are they? He looked through the glass into the dead wing. Staff. Patients. Memories. Doesn't matter. If you go in, the building gives you a shift. And I don't know anyone who has clocked out of that one. I never watched the East Wing again. Avoiding it did not mean forgetting it. For months afterward, I could feel its location in the building the way you can feel a bruise without touching it. I would be 3 corridors away, working on some ordinary problem, and know exactly which direction the sealed doors were. That awareness changed the hospital map inside my head. There were official routes, printed on signs and fire escape plans, and then there were the routes night staff actually used, shaped by broken lifts, locked doors, and things better left undisturbed. After the beckoning nurse, the east wing became a blank space I walked around, a dark lake under the floorboards of the building. Sometimes new staff asked why no one used that corridor as a shortcut. Someone would say it was out of the way, or too cold, or full of stored equipment. Small lies, merciful lies. The truth was too large to hand to someone on their first week. You have to learn a hospital slowly, the way you learn deep water. First the surface, then the currents, then the places where you do not swim. The doors were eventually covered with plywood during a renovation assessment. The old wing, I heard, was supposed to be demolished and converted into offices. It did not happen. Budgets changed. Plans stalled. The plywood stayed, painted the same dull color as the corridor wall, as if hiding a wound. But sometimes, passing that end of the second floor, staff still reported seeing light around the edges. And once, during a power outage, when the rest of the hospital ran on emergency generators, someone heard an old ward bell ringing behind the plywood. Not a modern alarm. A metal bell, sharp and insistent, from a time when nurses ran towards sound without knowing what waited. There was also the matter of the roster. I heard about it from a records clerk who liked old documents, and had no sense of when to stop digging. She found a box of staffing sheets from the East Wing, decades old, water-damaged but partly readable. Most were ordinary, names, dates, shifts, signatures and fading ink. But on several sheets from the months before the wing closed, the night shift had been filled in after the fact with the same phrase, written in different hands. Extra staff present. No name. Extra staff present. No name. No one knew who the extra staff had been. No payroll record matched. No agency invoice. No transfer note from another ward. Just those words, repeated whenever the wing was overwhelmed. Extra staff present. The clerk thought it was an accounting curiosity. I thought of the nurse behind the glass beckoning me in, and of my supervisor saying the building could give you a shift. Maybe the old wing had been short-staffed for longer than anyone knew. Maybe it learned to fill gaps with whoever came too close. Maybe some of the shapes I saw moving between beds had once been living workers who opened the door at the wrong moment, answering a call for help that was already decades old. That is why the beckoning stayed with me. It was not monstrous. It was practical. A ward in trouble does not care where help comes from. It sees hands and it uses them. I left that hospital years ago. I work in a newer building now, all glass and open spaces, too young to have much memory. Still, at night, when the lights flicker in an unused corridor, I think of the old East Wing running its shift behind sealed doors. Patients in their beds. Machines humming without power. A senior nurse on the other side of the glass, tired and stern, beckoning with 2 fingers. Come in. We could use the help. Almost there. Stay soft. Here is the next one. The code that was not called. When a code is called in a hospital, the building changes shape. One moment, everything is routine. Someone is signing medication charts. Someone is changing a dressing. Someone is arguing with a printer. Then the announcement comes overhead, flat and urgent, and every trained body within range turns toward it. You do not think much at first. Thinking comes later. You move. You run toward the room because somewhere, a heart has stopped, or breathing has stopped, or is about to, and the thin difference between life and death has become a matter of seconds, hands, drugs, electricity, and luck. I was part of the night code team for 18 months. It was not glamorous. Nothing in a real hospital is glamorous at 3 in the morning. It was sweat, crowded rooms, alarms, plastic packaging torn open with teeth, knees aching from compressions, voices trying to stay calm, and afterwards the strange silence when everyone looks at the clock and realizes the rest of the hospital kept going while one person's whole world ended. You learn the hospital by running through it. You learn which corridors are fastest, which doors need a shoulder, which lifts you cannot trust. You learn to hear the room number clearly through bad speakers and adrenaline. You learn not to let your face show what you fear when you arrive. So when the overhead speaker crackled and announced the code in room 22, I ran. Code blue, room 22. Code blue, room 22. Clear as anything. I was near the medication room on the 4th floor. The crash trolley was already moving from the station. 2 nurses, 1 junior doctor, a respiratory therapist, and I converged in the corridor with the practiced chaos of people who have done this too often. We ran toward room 22. Room 22 was dark. Not dim. Dark. The door was half open. We pushed in with the trolley, ready for the bed, the patient, the monitor, the family member crying in the corner. There was no patient. There was no bedding. No forestand. No monitor. No chair. The bed was stripped down to the mattress. The room had not been used all night. For a few seconds, the whole team simply stood there, breathing hard, looking at an empty bed. The junior doctor looked offended, as if the room had personally wasted his adrenaline. Wrong room? The nurse behind me grabbed the phone and called the operator. We responded to a code in 22. Where was the call from? I could hear the operator's confusion through the handset. No code had been called. No announcement had gone out. There was no record of anyone dialing the emergency code number. The overhead system had not been activated. The operator, who had been eating a sandwich at the desk, had heard nothing. We had all heard it. That was the part no explanation could soften. Not one person. Not a tired nurse mishearing a television. The entire team had heard the announcement. We had run together. We had repeated the room number to each other on the way. Code blue, room 22. We checked nearby rooms. No emergency. We checked the board. Room 22 vacant. We tested the overhead speakers later. Fine. We wrote it off as some system glitch no one could reproduce. Then it happened again. Different floor. Room 9. Code blue, room 9. Code blue, room 9. The team ran. Empty room. No call logged. Operator bewildered. 2 weeks later, room 41. Empty. Then room 16. Empty. Each time, the voice overhead sounded exactly like the hospital announcement system. Same tone. Same flat urgency. Sometimes the whole team heard it. Sometimes only those on a particular floor. Once, a nurse on break in the staff room heard the code through the speaker above the microwave, spilled soup down her scrubs, and sprinted halfway across the ward before realizing no one else was moving. Administration blamed crossed wires, old systems, human error, stress. The biomedical team tested equipment. The switchboard logs stayed clean. The overhead system had no record of the announcements. It became another hospital mystery filed under troublesome but non-billable. The night staff took it more seriously. We began keeping our own list. Room 22. 4th floor medical. Room 9. Surgical step-down. Room 41. Geriatrics. Room 16. Respiratory. We wrote dates beside them. Not in an official document. On a folded piece of paper taped inside a locker, because that is how hospitals record the truths they cannot put in incident reports. The pattern emerged slowly. Room 22 had held a young woman 2 years earlier who died after a sudden pulmonary embolism. The code team had been delayed because the call button system failed, and the nurse found her late. Room 9 had been the site of a postoperative arrest in which the patient could not be brought back. Room 41 belonged to an elderly man who had coded during visiting hours, with his wife still holding his hand. Room 16 had seen a respiratory patient die during a night when the ward was short-staffed, and everyone later insisted they should have checked sooner. Every phantom code came from a room where someone had died in a code. Not just any death. A code. A moment when the hospital had been summoned, when people had run, when hands had pressed on a chest, when someone had shouted for adrenaline, when the room had filled with effort and hope and failure. The hospital was not calling us to random empty rooms. It was replaying emergencies, or asking us to try again. Once we understood, we had a choice. We could ignore them. No one did. That was the unspoken rule. When the announcement came, you ran, even if the room was on the list. Even if your stomach sank because you recognized the number. Even if the operator swore over the phone that no code had been called. You ran because the alternative was impossible. What if this time it was real? What if a living patient had been assigned to that room and the system failed to log the call? What if you ignored it and someone died? And beneath that practical fear was another, harder to name. It felt cruel not to go. Whatever the phantom codes were, they carried need. Old need, perhaps. Useless need. But need all the same. Somewhere in the memory of those rooms, someone was still dying, still waiting for the team, still caught in the few minutes where everything might change if help arrived fast enough. So we ran. The ritual developed naturally. We would burst into the empty room with the crashed trolley, breathless and ashamed of feeling foolish. We would check, because you always check. Bed. Bathroom. Floor. Behind the curtain. Then, if the room was empty, one of us would say something. Not always the same person. Not always the same words. We're here. We came. You're not alone. We tried. Then we would stand a moment in the room's silence, surrounded by equipment meant for the living, and return to the ward. The first time someone spoke to the empty bed, I thought it was sentimental. Then I felt the room change. Not visibly. But the pressure eased. The air seemed to settle. The overhead speakers remained quiet for the rest of the night. After that, we always spoke. Months later, we had the worst one. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that turns hospital windows into black mirrors. The ward was full. Every bed. Patients in corridor bays. Staff stretched thin enough to see through. I had just sat down for the first time in 5 hours when the speaker above the nurse's station crackled. Code Blue, Room 7. Code Blue, Room 7. Every person at the station went still. Room 7 was not on our list. It was occupied. We ran. Room 7 held a man in his 60s admitted with heart failure. He had been stable an hour before. When we arrived, he was sitting upright, very much alive, looking startled by 6 people and a crashed trolley appearing at his door. "What's happened?" he asked. His monitor was normal. He was breathing. Pulse present. No code. The operator again had no record of a call. Everyone relaxed in that shaky, irritated way people do after false alarms. Everyone except one nurse, Maria, who had gone very pale. She kept staring at the patient. Check him, she said. We did. No. Properly. Something's wrong. Maybe it was because of the phantom codes. Maybe we had learned not to dismiss impossible warnings. The doctor examined him. We ran an ECG. Subtle changes. Bloods. Then more urgent bloods. Within an hour, cardiology was involved. He was transferred before dawn. The next day, we heard he had needed emergency intervention. He survived because the problem was caught early. There had never been a code in room 7 before. After that, none of us knew what the announcements meant. Were the old codes only echoes? Or had some part of the hospital learned to call before the crisis, calling us not to the dead, but to the living who might become them? Was it replaying failure, or trying to prevent it? Hospitals are full of systems designed to detect deterioration. Early warning scores. Monitors. Protocols. Maybe the building itself had developed a warning system from everything it had witnessed. A haunted hospital is still a hospital. It still wants patients to live. I left the code team eventually. My knees were bad, my nerves worse, and I needed work where overhead speakers did not decide the direction of my heartbeat. But on my last night, just before dawn, the speaker crackled one final time. Code Blue, room 22. Code Blue, room 22. The first room. The empty room. I was alone near the crashed trolley. Everyone else was tied up. For a second, I considered calling the operator first. Then training took over, or habit, or something kinder than both. I ran. Room 22 was empty as always. Stripped bed. Dim light. Rain at the window. I stood beside the mattress, breathing hard, and said, "We're here. We came. I'm sorry we were late before." The room felt very still. Then, from the overhead speaker inside room 22, so softly I almost missed it, a different sound came. Not the announcement voice. A single exhale. Like someone finally resting. There were fewer phantom codes after that, I heard. Not none. Hospitals never let go of everything. But fewer. I like to think some of the rooms heard us. I like to think the running mattered, even when there was no one left to save. I like to think that somewhere, in the deep memory of the building, a patient who died listening for footsteps finally heard them arrive. And if I ever hear an overhead speaker call a code in an empty room again, I will run. You should too. Because sometimes a hospital asks for help after it is too late. And sometimes, God help us, it asks just in time. There is a sound that comes after a failed code that no one warns you about. It is not crying, though there may be crying. It is not silence, though the silence is large. It is the sound of equipment being put away. Packaging gathered. Leads removed. The trolley checked and restocked for the next emergency. A bed space returned, slowly and respectfully, to usefulness. The hospital cannot collapse around one death, no matter how much the people in the room might want the world to stop. It resets. That reset is necessary. It is also brutal. I think the phantom codes came from the part of the building that could not reset. The part that remembered the exact pitch of the alarm, the exact weight of feet running, the exact second when hope became procedure and procedure became defeat. Rooms are supposed to forget so they can hold the next patient. But perhaps some rooms fail at that. Perhaps room 22 never became just a room again. Perhaps, every night, it remained the place where a young woman waited for a team that arrived too late. When we ran to those empty rooms, we were not saving the dead. I know that. I am not sentimental enough to believe we reversed anything. But maybe we were doing something else medicine rarely has time for. We were acknowledging the failure. We were returning to the scene and saying, with our bodies and breath and foolish crash trolley, that the life lost there had mattered enough for us to come again. In hospitals, that matters. Maybe more than we think. One of the respiratory therapists used to say that a code team is a promise with legs. I did not understand him until the phantom calls. When a code is called, the hospital promises that people will come, that the person in the bed will not be abandoned to the worst moment alone. Sometimes the promise fails. Elevators are slow. Rooms are far away. Bodies are fragile. Death is faster than training. But the promise itself is sacred. The phantom codes felt like the hospital testing whether we still believed in it. Every time we ran, even to an empty room, we answered yes. 2 more. Let your breathing slow with the rain. Here is the next. The nurse who was not on the rota. Night shifts on an understaffed ward teach you the limits of your own body. They teach you how long you can go without sitting, how much coffee your stomach can tolerate, how many times you can apologize for taking too long before the apology begins to feel like a wound. They teach you that care is not only kindness. It is time. And time is the thing hospitals never have enough of. The ward where I met her was always short. Officially, staffing met minimum requirements. Anyone who has worked on a ward knows how little that means. Minimum is a number invented by people who do not have to answer 3 bells at once while a confused patient climbs over bed rails and someone else vomits blood into a cardboard bowl. Nights were worse. Families thought night meant sleep. Management thought night meant quiet. But illness does not respect rotas. People deteriorate at night. People become frightened at night. People die at night. On the worst shifts, we drowned. That was when she appeared. The first time, I assumed she had been sent from another ward. She was older than most of us, perhaps in her late 50s, with gray threaded through dark hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She wore a nurse's uniform, though not quite the same cut as ours. Nothing dramatic. Just a little old-fashioned. She had the calmest hands I had ever seen. It was a terrible shift. 2 patients close to dying, 1 admission from emergency, 1 man with dementia trying to leave because he believed he had to catch a train, and a drug round that had fallen nearly an hour behind. I remember standing in the medication room with tears of exhaustion threatening, trying to draw up an antibiotic while 3 call bells rang. When I came out, 2 of the bells had stopped. The man looking for the train was back in bed, asleep. One of the dying patients, who had been restless and frightened all evening, lay calm with his hand held in both of hers. The unknown nurse sat beside him, speaking too softly for me to hear. I felt such relief that I did not question her. "Thank you," I whispered when I passed. She looked up and smiled. "You had your hands full," she said. Her voice was ordinary. Warm. A little tired. By morning, she was gone. No one knew who she was. "Bank staff," someone said. "Agency," said someone else. "Maybe from palliative care." That seemed likely enough. Hospitals constantly borrow staff from one place to patch another. Names blur. Faces change. If a competent nurse appears on a hard night and helps, you do not interrogate the gift. She appeared again 2 weeks later. Another awful night. This time a woman in bed 4 was dying badly, which is a phrase I hate but cannot replace. Some deaths are peaceful. Others are hard work for everyone, especially the person doing the dying. Her breathing was ragged. Her family were stuck in traffic. We were trying to manage symptoms, reassure another patient disturbed by the sounds, and keep the rest of the ward functioning. The older nurse was suddenly there. I did not see her arrive. One moment the bedside chair was empty. The next, she sat in it, leaning close to the dying woman. "There now," she murmured. "Not long. You're doing very well." The woman's breathing eased. Not medically, perhaps. Not in a way that changed the outcome. But her face softened. Her hands unclenched. By the time her family arrived, she was calm enough for them to kiss her goodbye without terror filling the room. Afterward, I looked for the older nurse to thank her. Gone. This time, I asked the coordinator. No additional staff had been assigned to our ward. No one from palliative care had come overnight. No bank nurse matching her description had clocked in. We checked the rota. Nothing. That should have frightened me. It did a little. But fear was not the strongest feeling. Gratitude was. Whoever she was, she had helped. Over months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She appeared only at night. Only on the worst nights. And almost always when someone was near death. She did not help with paperwork. She did not do medication rounds, or admissions, or the endless list of measurable tasks that management pretends defines nursing. Her work was older than that. She sat. She held hands. She adjusted pillows. She wiped mouths. She hummed sometimes, low and tuneless. She told frightened people they were not alone. She seemed to know when a patient needed the curtains drawn, and when they needed them open. She knew which families needed tea and which needed silence. She had that rare gift some nurses carry, the ability to make death less lonely without pretending it is less serious. Patients loved her. The ones who were still conscious would ask for her after she left. "Where's the kind nurse?" they would say. "Which nurse?" "The one who said my mother was waiting." Or, "The one who told me the pain would stop soon." Or, "The one with the warm hands." Warm hands. That detail came up often. No one knew her name. We tried to find out. Of course we did. We were nurses, not fools. We checked staff records, old photographs, ID logs. The cameras were useless in the way cameras become useless in ghost stories and hospitals alike. A blur in the corridor. A figure half blocked by a trolley. A seated shape beside a bed, face washed out by the monitor glow. Never enough. One healthcare assistant claimed she saw the woman walk through the double doors without opening them. Another said she followed her toward the linen room and found only stacked sheets. I never saw anything so dramatic. My experiences with her were painfully ordinary. She looked like a nurse. She acted like a nurse. That was what made it so hard to know where fear belonged. Then one night, I found her in the side room with Mr. Price. Mr. Price was dying of lung cancer. He was angry about it, and had every right to be. Some patients become peaceful near the end. Some become philosophical. Mr. Price became furious. Furious at his body, his doctors, his absent son, the television, the soup, the window view, the fact that the hospital blanket was too thin and too heavy at the same time. Underneath all that anger was fear so raw no one could touch it. That night, his breathing worsened. We called the doctor, adjusted medications, did everything we could. He pushed my hand away and told me to leave him alone, then immediately called out because he did not want to be alone. His son had not answered the phone. I stepped out for supplies and returned to find the older nurse beside him. His face had changed. Not happy. Not even calm. But listening. She held his hand between hers. "I wasted so much," he whispered. "Most people do," she said. That answer startled me. It was not the soft lie I expected. Mr. Price gave a broken laugh that became a cough. "Is it too late?" For some things, she said. Not for all. Will it hurt? Not when it matters, he cried then, quietly. She stayed with him until morning. His son arrived just after dawn, breathless and ashamed, and Mr. Price was still alive long enough to hear him say, "I'm here, Dad." He died 20 minutes later with both of them holding him. When I looked up, the older nurse was gone. I stopped wanting to know what she was after that. Some mysteries are lessened by answers. The ward accepted her in the way wards accept useful miracles. No one spoke her name because we did not have one. We called her, when we had to, the night nurse. Not to management. Not in handover. Among ourselves softly. Did the night nurse come? She sat with bed too. Good. I was worried about him. Good. That was the word we used most. Because she was good. Not harmless, exactly. Nothing that walks between life and death is harmless. But kind. She filled the gap we hated most, the gap between what dying patients deserve and what understaffed wards can provide. She did not save them. That was not her job. She made sure they were seen off properly. Near the end of my time on that ward, I found an old photograph in a storage cupboard while looking for spare blood pressure cuffs. It had fallen behind a shelf, curled and dusty. A ward staff photo from decades earlier. Nurses lined up in uniforms from another era, some stern, some smiling, a matron seated in the center. At the far left stood the night nurse. Younger, yes. Hair dark. Face less tired. But unmistakable. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written the year and a list of names. Her name was Margaret Hale. I searched the hospital archive later, something I told myself was harmless curiosity. Staff nurse Margaret Hale had worked nights on our ward for 32 years. She was known for sitting with dying patients when families could not come. She had no children. No close relatives listed. She retired late, reluctantly, and died less than a year later. In the hospital. On our ward. In a side room. At night. The note in the old staff newsletter said she passed peacefully after a short illness, attended by former colleagues. I wondered whether anyone held her hand. I left nursing for a while after that ward. Burnout mostly. The feeling that I had given too much of myself to a system that would take everything and still ask for more. But I thought of Margaret often. When guilt kept me awake, I thought of her sitting in the chair I had not had time to sit in. When I remembered patients who died while I was busy elsewhere, I hoped she had found them first. Years later, my mother died in a hospital in another city. I was there, but only barely. Anyone who has watched a parent die knows the strange way time becomes both too much and not enough. I had stepped out to speak with the doctor, and when I returned, my mother was calmer than before. The nurse was kind. She whispered. Which nurse? Older lady. Warm hands. She said you were just outside and I shouldn't worry. There was no nurse in the room. The assigned nurse was at the station. No one else had gone in. My mother died that night while I held her hand. I do not know if it was Margaret. I do not know whether kindness travels, whether a nurse who refuses to stop working in one hospital can somehow answer need in another. Maybe my mother dreamed her. Maybe I did. Maybe all wards have someone like that, if they are lucky. But when my time comes, if it comes in a hospital, in the small hours when the living staff are run off their feet and I am frightened despite everything I know, I hope I look up and see an older nurse pulling a chair to my bedside. I hope her hands are warm. I hope she tells me, softly, that it is all right. And I hope, whoever she is, she stays. I kept the photograph of Margaret Hale, though I probably should not have. Not the original. I copied it and returned the old one to the archive box, but the copy stayed folded in the back of my diary for years. Whenever I doubted what we had seen, I looked at it. There she was, young, unsmiling, standing slightly apart from the others as if she had been called into the picture from a task she wanted to return to. Even on paper, even decades before I met her, she looked like someone listening for a bell. One detail in the staff newsletter stayed with me too. It said Margaret had been offered promotion several times and refused each one. She did not want an office. She did not want administration. She wanted nights on the ward. She once wrote, in a retirement note quoted by the newsletter, that nights were when patients told the truth. I understand that now. Daytime patients perform. They smile for doctors. They tidy themselves for visitors. They say they are fine because everyone is busy. At night, pain gets honest. Fear gets honest. Loneliness gets honest. Margaret had spent a lifetime listening to that honesty. Maybe death did not change her because she had already been living half in that borderland, sitting beside people when the lights were low and the masks came off. That is why none of us feared her the way we feared other things in the hospital. She was not an interruption of nursing. She was nursing stripped down to its oldest form. A chair, a hand, a voice in the dark saying, "I will not leave." Modern hospitals are full of language that tries to measure care, outcomes, targets, audits, satisfaction scores. Margaret belonged to a part of nursing older than measurement. No form could capture what changed in a dying patient's face when she entered the room. No staffing model could account for the extra minute she somehow gave everyone. She was proof, unsettling and comforting at once, that some duties are so deeply learned they survive the person who learned them. Maybe that is what a vocation becomes if it is strong enough. Not a job. Not a role. A shape the soul keeps after everything else falls away. Last one now. Let this be the one you fall asleep to. The bed that refills. On our ward, bed 3 was always made. That was the first thing I noticed. It was in Bay A, one of 4 beds arranged around a central space with curtains between them and a window that looked out over the flat roof of the outpatient department. Bed 1 was closest to the door. Bed 2 had the good view. Bed 4 was near the radiator that clanged in winter. Bed 3 sat in the corner, not special in any way I could see. But when it was empty, senior staff treated it differently. Every ward has habits. Some are practical, some superstitious, and most are both. Do not put the confused patients near the door unless you want to chase. Keep spare blankets in the bottom drawer because nights get cold. Never say the word quiet out loud. I learned these quickly. But bed 3's rule was stranger. If bed 3 emptied during the day, we cleaned it, remade it, and left it ready. Even if admissions said no one was coming. Even if every other empty bed was stripped. Even if we desperately needed to move someone there. Bed 3 stayed made up at night. Just leave it, the senior nurse told me on my first week. Why? Because it's bed 3. This was apparently considered an explanation. I assumed it had to do with infection control, bed management, or some old equipment issue no one wanted to explain to a new staff member. Hospitals are full of rules that begin as sensible and fossilize into ritual. I left bed 3 alone. Then, one night, I found someone in it. I was doing 2 o'clock observations. The bay was dim, curtains half drawn, the other patients asleep in various uncomfortable positions. Rain tapped the window. The small night light above the sink gave everything a bluish cast. Bed 1 sleeping. Bed 2 sleeping. Bed 4 awake but pretending not to be because he did not want me to ask about pain. Bed 3, occupied. An old woman lay there, tucked neatly under the blanket. For a moment, I thought admissions had brought someone while I was busy. That happens. Patients appear on wards with paperwork trailing behind them like weather. But there was no chart at the foot of the bed. No wristband that I could see. No bag of belongings. No medication. Just an old woman, silver hair spread against the pillow, hands folded over the sheet, breathing slowly. I went to the station. "Who's in bed 3? The senior nurse looked up sharply. "You saw her?" That was not the response I wanted. "There is a patient in bed 3. Did you wake her?" "No." "Good. Don't." "Who is she?" The senior nurse stood and walked with me to the bay. Bed 3 was empty. The sheets were smooth. The pillow held no dent. The blanket was tucked so perfectly it looked untouched. I checked the bathroom. Empty. The corridor. Empty. The other patients were asleep, except bed 4, who watched us with wide eyes. "She was there," I whispered. "I know," the senior nurse said. Bed 4 pulled his blanket up to his chin. The explanation came later, over tea in the staff room, because hospitals ration truth according to how likely you are to quit. The woman's name had been Elsie. Elsie Warren. Long-term patient years before my time. No close family. Chronic illness, frequent admissions, then one final stay that became months. The ward became her home because she had no other place that still knew her. Bed 3 was hers. She kept sweets in the bedside drawer for staff. She knew everyone's birthdays. She complained about the soup and adored the student nurses. She died in bed 3 just before dawn on a rainy morning. Afterward, bed 3 did not stay empty. At first, staff thought they were imagining things. A shape under the blanket during night rounds. A pillow dented in the morning though no one had used it. The smell of lavender soap. A call bell pressed once, gently, from an empty bed. Then a nurse saw her clearly, sleeping there with her hands folded over the sheet. Elsie came back to her bed. Not every night. Only when it was made up and empty. She would appear sometime after midnight and leave before dawn. She did not speak. She did not frighten patients usually. She simply slept. "What if someone else is in the bed?" I asked. The senior nurse's face changed. "We avoid that." "But what if the hospital is full?" "The hospital is always full." "We still avoid it." Eventually, of course, someone did not. The story belonged to a nurse who had left before I started. One winter night, bed pressures were terrible. Emergency was overflowing. Management insisted every available bed be used. The night coordinator assigned a new patient to bed 3 despite the ward staff arguing. The patient was a man recovering from surgery, too drowsy to know or care where he was placed. Bed 3 was occupied by the living when the small hours came. At 3:15, every patient in Bay woke to the sound of an old woman crying. The man in bed 3 was found standing in the middle of the bay, pale and shaking, still attached to his foreline. He said he had woken because someone was trying to get into the bed beside him. Not attacking him. Not climbing on top of him. Just trying to lie down in the narrow space he occupied, with the stubborn confusion of someone returning home to find a stranger in their room. He said he felt cold hands pushing gently at his shoulder, heard an old voice whispering, "This is mine, dear. You're in my place." The patient was moved before morning. After that, bed 3 stayed empty at night, no matter who complained. I should say here that Elsie was not malicious. That matters. Some hauntings are territorial because they are cruel. Hers was territorial because she had so little. Bed 3 had been her last home. The nurses had been her last family. The ward, with all its noise and indignity and fluorescent light, had been the place where she was known. So we kept the bed made. There was tenderness in the ritual. Fresh sheet. Pillow straight. Blanket folded down slightly. Water jug filled, though no one would drink it. Sometimes, if the night had been hard, a nurse would place one of the wrapped biscuits Elsie used to like on the bedside table. By morning, it was usually still there. Once, the wrapper had been turned over neatly, as if examined by someone with no appetite but good manners. Patients notice things. They always do. "Why don't you use that bed?" asked Bed 2 one evening. "We keep it ready," I said. "For who?" I hesitated. Bed 2, a sharp-eyed woman with a chest infection and no patience for nonsense, looked at me for a long moment and said, "The old lady?" My mouth went dry. "You've seen her?" "Last night. She came in after you did your checks. Nice face. Terrible slippers. She looked at me like she was making sure I was behaving." "Were you frightened?" Bed 2 shrugged. "I've been in hospital 6 weeks. Takes more than an old woman in slippers to frighten me." Then she added softer, "It was comforting, actually. Felt like someone was keeping watch." That was Elsie. Keeping watch. Coming home. Sleeping where she had been cared for. Over time, I grew used to her. That is another strange thing about hospitals. The impossible becomes part of routine if it does not interfere too much with medication rounds. I would enter Bay A at 3 in the morning and see the slight shape under Bed 3's blanket. I would lower my voice. I would check the other patients. Sometimes I would pause beside her bed, not too close, and whisper, "Good night, Elsie." I never saw her eyes open. Not until my last month on the ward. It was a brutal night. The kind that leaves marks. We had lost a patient in another bay after a long decline, admitted 2 more from emergency, and spent hours trying to find a confused man who had made it as far as the stairwell before anyone noticed. By 4, I was close to tears from exhaustion. I went into Bay A to check on everyone and found Elsie in Bed 3. She was awake. Her eyes were open, pale and clear, looking toward the ceiling. I froze just inside the curtain. She turned her head. For a moment, I forgot she was dead. That is how real she looked. Old, frail, tired, but present. A patient awake in the night. "Nurse," she said. Her voice was thin but ordinary, the voice of a woman trying not to bother anyone. Every instinct in me answered before fear could. "Yes, Elsie? You look worn out, dear." I laughed once, badly. "A bit. Sit down. Just for a minute." I should not have. There were tasks waiting. There are always tasks waiting. But beside Bed 3 sat the chair where generations of nurses had probably collapsed for stolen seconds, and I sat. Elsie looked at me with such kindness that my eyes filled. "They work you too hard," she said. "They always have." "Yes. But you still come." The room was quiet around us. Bed 1 snored softly. Rain whispered at the glass. "Why do you stay?" I asked. She smiled a little. "Where else would I go? This is my bed. These are my nurses. Someone should look after you lot. You never do it yourselves." I cried then, quietly and embarrassingly, beside the bed of a dead woman who had more compassion than half the living administrators I knew. She did not move to touch me. I am grateful for that. I think it might have broken something in me. She only watched until I wiped my face. "There," she said. "Better." When I looked again, she was asleep. At dawn, bed 3 was empty. I left that ward a few weeks later. On my last night, I made bed 3 myself. I took more care than necessary. Hospital corners. Smooth sheet. Fresh pillowcase. Blanket folded exactly the way Elsie liked it, though I could not have said how I knew that. Before I left, I placed a cup of tea on her bedside table. Too much milk. No sugar. It was cold by morning, of course. Untouched, probably. I did not stay to find out. I have worked in other places since. Cleaner places. Better funded places. Places where every bed is tracked on screens and no one would tolerate keeping one empty for a ghost. They are efficient, and efficiency has its virtues. But on hard nights, I think of bed 3. A bed kept ready. A place saved for someone who had nowhere else. A ward that, despite everything, remembered how to be kind to its dead. People think hauntings are about fear. Sometimes they are. Sometimes a haunting is a warning, or a hunger, or an old pain repeating itself. But sometimes a haunting is only love that has nowhere else to sleep. Sometimes it is an old woman returning to the last place she was known by name, trusting that the nurses will have made the bed. And I think there are worse things for a hospital to be than haunted by gratitude. Before I left, one of the junior nurses asked whether keeping bed 3 empty was really fair. She did not mean it cruelly. She meant that somewhere in emergency, a living patient might be waiting on a trolley while we preserved a bed for someone already dead. It was a fair question, and the kind hospitals force on staff every day. Who gets the space? Who gets the time? Who gets comfort when comfort itself is scarce? The senior nurse listened, then took her to Bea before dawn. Elsie was there that night, a small shape under the covers. The other patients were sleeping peacefully. The ward, for once, was calm. The senior nurse pointed, not at Elsie, but at the whole bay. "That bed gives more than it takes," she said. I did not understand until later. Bed 3 made us softer. That sounds sentimental, but it is true. Because we kept that bed ready for Elsie, we remembered that patients were more than admissions and discharges. Because we respected the dead, we treated the living with a little more patience. Because an old woman came back to sleep there, the bay felt watched over, and frightened patients slept easier. The empty bed was not wasted space. It was a reminder. Hospitals need reminders. Without them, everything becomes numbers. Length of stay. Bed occupancy. Discharge targets. Staffing ratios. Necessary numbers, yes, but numbers all the same. Elsie turned one corner of the ward back into a human place. She made us ask what it means to belong somewhere at the end of your life. She made us make a bed with care even when no living manager had asked us to. Maybe that is why she stayed. Not because she could not leave, but because the ward still needed her. And maybe we needed the discipline of making space. That is a strange thing to say in a hospital, where space is always fought over, counted, justified, and filled. But bed 3 taught us that not every emptiness is waste. Some empty spaces are promises. A chair kept open for a family member on the way. A quiet room prepared before bad news is given. A bed made for an old woman who comes home after midnight. The living noticed even when they did not understand. They felt that the ward could remember. And if a ward could remember Elsie, perhaps it might remember them too. That's all the tapes for tonight. You made it to the end, or maybe the rain against the window carried you off to sleep somewhere along the way. That's all right. That's what this is for. The stories are done now. The corridors are empty. The call lights are quiet. The old wing is dark behind its doors. The code team has gone back to the station. The visitor after hours has finished her rounds. The nurse who was not on the rota has pulled her chair beside someone who needs her. Bed 3 is made up, smooth and waiting. But none of that is near you. You are not on shift tonight. You are home, warm and well. No one needs you to run toward an alarm. No one is pressing a button in an empty room. No overhead speaker is calling your name. The only sound is the rain, and the rain asks nothing from you. Let your shoulders go heavy. Let your hands unclench. Let your breathing slow. The door is locked. The dark is just the dark. If you want more, the next tape is already waiting. But for now, rest. Sleep well. And I will see you again, next time, after midnight. And if a bell rings in your dreams, let someone else answer it tonight, softly, safely, far away from you. The rain keeps falling for a while longer. Softly, steadily, like a night nurse making one last round. And if you wake later, with the room dark and your mind floating somewhere between sleep and listening, do not worry if the stories return in pieces. That is what stories like these do. A corridor here. A pale square of light there. The memory of a call bell. The soft slide of a drawer. Let them pass the way rain passes over glass. They belong to the tape now. They belong to the hospital in the distance, not to your room. No one is standing outside your door. No one is waiting at the end of your hallway. There is no patient chart with your name on it, no shift you forgot to finish, no old wing asking you to come in. You have done enough for tonight. You can let the ward fade. You can let the machines grow quieter. You can let the rain cover the last of the footsteps. Sleep now. The night staff have it from here. Somewhere far away, under dim corridor lights, someone is checking a chart, someone is closing a door softly, someone is whispering that they are here and asking what is needed. Let them keep watch. Let the rain answer the windows. Let the stories end where they belong, behind the ward doors, after midnight. Sleep deep. The corridor lights are fading now.